Welcome in to the latest episode of the College Football Podcast. Week 2 is on deck. Got some predictions to go over, got some narratives to discuss. Not as loaded this week as we were last week, but still stuff to talk about, still stuff to break down. So let's get into it. Raise your hand if you know about the border war. Kansas at Missouri, a rivalry renewed. So this is a historical rivalry between Missouri and Kansas. It was last played in 2011. Hasn't been played since Missouri left the Big 12 for the SEC, unfortunately. Now, I grew up in Missouri for a little bit. I didn't end up going to the University of Missouri. I went to a different college elsewhere. So I'm not, Missouri. I'm a fan of Missouri, but they're not my number one team by any means. But this was a rivalry I grew up on because growing up I was a big Missouri fan. Missouri leads this series 56-55, by the way, according to Winsipedia. I only care about that because it's so close. I usually don't care about historical, records because, I don't care about the however many games you played between 1920 and 1960 and how lopsided it was. It's not, an important thing. I just think this one's interesting because it's so close. But like I was saying, this is a rivalry I grew up on. That 2007 season, that game, that was one of the, that's when I really fell in love with college football, like many people. But this game, I'm looking forward to it a lot. But yeah, that game was, Chase Daniel. I remember watching him, Jeremy Maclin, Chase Kaufman on Missouri, the classic Todd Reesing sacked with the face full of dirt. That was, I think that was a number 4 versus number 2 matchup. So high level matchup there in 2007. Like I said, that's when I, really fell in love with college football. But the QB matchup for this game, Jalen Daniels, Bo Prabula, that's a pretty exciting one. I think both of them have a lot of similarities. Maybe Bo Prabula is a little bit better with his arm, but let's get into Kansas. So Jalen Daniels has to play to the best of his ability. It's kind of like he almost in a way has to put the team on his back, but without doing so. Putting the team on your back, I mean, they have to come through too. His team has to come through for him, but he's going to have to play, I don't think an inkling less of what his full capability is, because I don't know that elsewhere on this team Kansas matches up very well with Missouri. I don't think that line of scrimmage matchup is super favorable. I think the skilled positions are just kind of lacking a touch there, but Jalen Daniels is the most dynamic player, I think, on the field between both teams at his best. So he's got to play to his full potential. The other thing is they need to get after that Missouri O-line, force Bo Prabula out of the pocket. There was some instances in that first game with Missouri. It's just the first game. You don't want to read too much into it, but there just seems like there could be a potential weakness there, so they need to try and exploit that if at all possible. On the Missouri side, they need to obviously, play complementary football, keep Bo safe in the pocket. On the flip side, we don't need him taking hits this early in the season. He does have some, running ability, but he doesn't need to be running out of the pocket, getting hit all the time just here in week 2. So, rely more on Ahmad Hardy in the backfield. But Bo Prabula, he can beat you with his arm. That running back, I think he should be pretty good for Missouri. So Missouri has a good team here. I don't think they have to do anything crazy. They just need to have a solid game plan and stick to it. Nothing crazy. You don't have to be scrambling around all over the place. But if that O-line is struggling, then it changes things massively, obviously. Missouri played on August 28th, so they've had a long week in preparation for this. Kansas they played in week 0, obviously. Then they did play on the 29th. So both teams have a bit longer of a prep, a bit longer time between games to prep for this one. So it's going to be a big one. They should be ready. The current line as of 9-3. 9-3. That was a couple days ago. Let's look this up real quick. The current line at FanDuel for this game is Missouri is still favored by 6.5, so it hasn't changed. So I think that's, as far as the point spread line goes, that's, not crazy. I don't really have a super good sense for it, but I would probably pick, Missouri on that for, I don't think that Kansas would cover, just because it's under 7. If it was Kansas, +7 or +7.5, maybe I'd pick them. But I think Missouri is going to win the game, probably cover, that 6.5. I don't think it's going to be, a blowout by any means, but I don't think it's going to be, 3 points or less. So yeah, I would probably stay away from that line unless you just have a real good, predictive method out there. So, but the border war, looking forward to that one. Going to be, for me, one of the best games of the week. So I wanted to kind of get in real quick to what narratives I think could change around the sport this week. There's just a couple things I want to talk about, just the way we view teams. I'm very outside of just, it's even hard to say outside of stunning results, but stunning results too. There's not a lot that can happen in like week 1. Same thing most of the time for week 2, even depending on the scenario, week 3, there's not a lot that can happen that really changes my opinion a whole lot one way or the other about teams. I don't really try and draw conclusions. I try and keep an open mind. I move the needle a little less, in the first couple of weeks of the season for teams. Like I ranked Florida State, I think 22nd or somewhere in there, and Bama 16th. Even though Florida State beat them, we just don't know what either team is yet. I know what I think about that game individually, but overall for the whole season, 50,000 foot view, I still don't have a fully developed opinion of either team. So I'm just kind of moving that needle slower than a lot of other people would. But let's get into this. So the AP poll, for example, has Illinois at 11th coming into this game. If they don't win, they play Duke this week, by the way. If they don't win, then what does that mean for Illinois? What does that mean for Duke, for example? So Illinois is expected to be a team that's going to probably compete or push for a Big Ten title appearance. And if they're losing to Duke, especially by a lot in week 2, then that's probably going to tell us a bit about Illinois that we don't want to hear. It's going to tell us that, A, Duke is probably pretty decent, and Illinois is at the very least just not what we thought they would be. Can't go so far as to say that they're going to be bad yet if something like that happens, but it does also just kind of weaken the Big Ten overall if Illinois doesn't hold up their end of the bargain this year. But I think it probably says more about Illinois if that were to happen than it would Duke if Duke wins. Even if Duke wins by a lot, I think Duke is going to be pretty decent this year. So if they go in there and win by a lot, I think that says more about Illinois than Duke, for example. But that changes kind of the outlook of the Big Ten, for a lot of teams, and just whenever you're perceiving how strong a conference is. If Illinois doesn't hold up that, then it's going to be tough for the Big Ten coming down the road, whenever you're talking about conference strength and the perception that, comes along with that. But Baylor at SMU, for example, SMU number 17 in the AP poll. The lens through which we view Auburn is going to be influenced by this game, and Baylor, obviously. Baylor, they're on the line here. It's as well the lens in which we view them. If Baylor goes in and they get stomped by SMU, it's going to make that win that Auburn had last week look a little bit less impressive. Now, if Baylor goes in there and rolls, then it's going to A, make Auburn look a little bit more impressive, and B, it's going to make SMU look really bad. So, that's kind of how things are going to change coming out of that game depending on the result. But right now, I think I expect, I think I expect SMU to win, which means Baylor to be off to an 0-2 start. Just depending on how they play in that game will kind of determine how I'm going to view Auburn for the next week or so until they play, bigger opponents. Ole Miss, they play at Kentucky this week. Kentucky, they won last year and probably kept Ole Miss out of the playoff last year. So what does this game mean, for Ole Miss? What does it mean for Lane Kiffin? If they lose, then it's going to tell us that, A, that this team is obviously they're not as good as they were last year, even though they lost last year, which I think we know that already. But B, I'm gonna have some questions, about how good that team is first, obviously, and then also how serious they are as competitors this year. I don't want to, and that sounds bad. I don't mean that to be rude, but it's just if they go in there and they lose to Kentucky again, I'm going to question the preparation there at Ole Miss, because that will be back-to-back years, and you had a better team last year. Kentucky, they're not a great team, but they got fight, so it's not one to look over for Ole Miss by any means. Like I said earlier, Kansas, obviously they play at Missouri this week. this is a game that's going to tell us where are the Tigers trending under Drinkwitz, because there was a lot of turnover the last couple of years. They built up. They had a great, last 2 seasons. So how are they trending with the departure of names like Luther Burden, and Brady Cook there? So, I mean, they brought in talent too, but where is that team trending? This is going to be a big year for finding out, how good of a coach Drink is at Missouri, how good he can handle turnover, how good he can replace talent there, and, continue to develop it in the process. This game is going to be a good litmus test for that. How legit are the Jayhawks this year? We're going to find out probably this Saturday. They've had a great 2 first weeks of the season, but, they were playing cupcakes, so if Jalen Daniels stays healthy, if he can be a dynamic player, then I think that, we're probably going to find out that with him at his full potential, they can be a good, team, probably 8 wins. But if he doesn't play well, or if he has ups and downs this season, starting on Saturday, then we'll find out the opposite too about him. USF at Florida. So UFS beat Boise last week, leaving absolutely no doubt in the process. Can they compete with Florida? If they can, does it say more about USF or does it say more about Florida? Because I think that, it could tell us a lot about both teams, obviously, this game. So, and the other question I have is, can Florida be elite? Because if Florida is elite, or if they can be elite, I think we'll find out this game or not. Because, like I said, USF is coming off that Boise State victory. They're feeling hot. They're feeling confident. They're feeling like, a lot of people are looking at them like they may be one of the best G5 teams at this time coming into week 2. And if Florida just goes out there and smokes them, then I think, that tells us that USF is maybe not as good as we thought they were, which would reflect also poorly on Boise State. But B, elite teams, or teams that can be elite, teams that have elite potential, they smoke teams like USF pretty much most of the time, regardless of how good that team is. Now, it could be kind of back and forth, higher scoring on both sides than we think, but, ultimately Florida pulls away and wins, and that could be, that could be good for Florida too. But if USF keeps it close, or if, God forbid, for Florida fans, they upset the Gators, then that tells us a lot of bad things about Billy Napier's future there probably, and a lot of good things about the future of USF for this season. But I'm most interested to see if Florida does have that elite, potential, because they're going to need it for the schedule they have coming up. And if you drop a game like USF, that means you're probably not headed in a good direction. Is there any hope for Mississippi State this year after that terrible season last year? Is Arizona State a contender this year like they were last year? So Mississippi State, obviously, Jeff Lebby's first year last year. You want to see some progression here. They're not expected to do very well this season, but if they're moving in the right direction, where are they trending, and how good of a season could they have? If they are better, if they are improved, how improved are they? How does the record look? This is a big kind of swing game for the season early on for both teams, because especially perceptionally, if Arizona State goes in there and they get beat by what's perceived to be the worst team in the SEC, then it's not going to reflect good for the Big 12, and it's not going to, reflect very well on Arizona State. They don't want to get too fat and happy off that one playoff appearance they had, not disregarding that at all. It's a great season they had last year, but it's a new year this year, so we have to put that behind us. So this is a good, big perception game for both teams for sure, as well as the strength of the Big 12. And lastly, Michigan at Oklahoma. What is John Mateer's ceiling? How good is the Michigan, in Oklahoma defense? How good is the Michigan run game? How good is the OU run defense? I think Michigan is going to want to have to run the ball a lot, because I think that Bryce Underwood winning the game with his arm is probably not likely, just because he's going up against a great defense there with, Oklahoma and Brent Venables. Not that he's not talented or can't throw it, but it's just a lot to ask of a true freshman to go win you a game on the road against, a defense like that. So they're going to have to run the ball. How good is Oklahoma's run defense? Can they stop the run? Because if they can stop the run, Oklahoma's going to win this football game. And if they can't, not only are they, is it going to be much harder for them to win, but it's going to be, it's not going to be a great sign for the season that they have coming up, because they have a really tough schedule too. But back to John Mateer, what is his ceiling as a passer? I know he had a great stats at Washington State and everything, but in the SEC with this schedule, Michigan in the out of conference, they tend to have a pretty good defense more often than not. So, what is his ceiling as a passer? If he goes out there and he puts up 120, plays a game kind of like Julian Sayin did, against Texas, then that doesn't scream, high potential for the season for Oklahoma to me this year. But if their run game can pick it up, then, obviously if they play complementary football and win, then that, eases the pain on that a little bit. But he's expected to be a high-level passer and a high-level quarterback there at Oklahoma. So this game could, kind of dampen the spirits of some Sooners if he doesn't live up to the preseason expectations there, fair or not. Just ended that segment with a little Michigan-Oklahoma talk. Going to roll into the next one with the prediction for the game. So, this is a matchup that we have only had one time before. And according to that, old trusty Winsipedia, this is a matchup, like I said, that we've had one time ever. So, the teams have only met once in 1975. Oklahoma won 14-6. Obviously has no bearing on this game. It's just interesting. It's such a rare, matchup. I would have thought that we would have seen them play more. So I will say I took Michigan +6 earlier in the week. So I tweeted that out. So make sure you're following me on Twitter if you want to trail any of my bets or just are interested in that sort of thing. I won't make graphics or anything like that for it, but I will just tweet it out whenever I am taking it. It's hard if I, have a day. Like I'm going to tweet out all my bets this week. That line can move, obviously. So, but yeah, I took Michigan +6 earlier in the week. Right now, it's not far off that. It's Michigan. They're, 5.5 is the number now. So, like I said, make sure you follow on Twitter. Either way, I think it'll be a close game. This game I think is bigger for Oklahoma. Obviously, the Venables hot seat talk that we've had, over the offseason brought in John Mateer to win these kinds of games for them. It's a big for conference perception either way. Last week we had the perceived probably Big Ten number one and SEC number one, and the SEC did not come out on top. Big Ten did. So now these, aren't the perceived number two teams in either conference, but it is interesting that we had Michigan, Ohio State's, rival this week playing Oklahoma, who's Texas's number one rival. So it's kind of funny. So, but anyways, big game for, perceptionally, not just for the teams, but for the conference strength either way. True freshman Bryce Underwood versus Brent Venables' defense. So how will the pass game go? Obvious question here. Venables probably going to throw the kitchen sink at him as far as looks and blitzes and disguising coverages and all of that. So it's going to be tough, I think, for Michigan to rely on him passing the ball. Expect them to rely on the run game on the Michigan side. But, obviously run opens up the pass. So if you're getting gashed on the ground as Oklahoma, then you may have to look out for Bryce Underwood whenever he may start to sling it. But I think Michigan's going to probably have to win the game on the ground. Obviously, Alabama transferred Justice Hayes, perfect for this challenge. He's capable of doing that for Michigan, I believe. Michigan secondary, though, they also have to play well because I think John Mateer, reversely, Oklahoma is probably going to try and spin it through the air. So that secondary for Michigan is going to have to play well. That pass rush is going to have to get home for Oklahoma. Strong run game potential for sure with Jaden Ott, but like I said, I think that they're going to be throwing more. That's why they brought John Mateer in. They didn't bring John Mateer and his OC into, Norman to not throw the ball to win these kinds of games, and I think that's, what they're going to have to do. But how dynamic is that passing going to be? How reliable can they lean on the run whenever they need to? And how reliable is the passing? Because while I think that John Mateer is probably going to be a pretty good quarterback there, he's still unproven at Oklahoma in these bigger games like this. So if he comes out and lays an egg, not a good sign. The O-line and the wide receivers obviously need to stay in the game for Oklahoma. Can't lose everyone like we did last year. Obvious statement, but last year when you have that many injuries strung together, it's just, it's insane. So I think that Oklahoma does enough defensively to thwart Bryce Underwood, and I think John Mateer comes through enough for Oklahoma. I think I'm going to give benefit of the doubt to the Oklahoma offense until proven wrong. So I think that Oklahoma wins. I think Michigan covers, especially at that +6 number. So there's some other interesting matchups coming up this week, but I'm not going to spend too much time on breaking them down, more in depth, just because there's some good matchups, but I think that they're going to be, some of them I think are going to be kind of lopsided. So this one I don't think will be lopsided. However, Illinois at Duke, Illinois is favored. 2.5 is the number. I think it's likely going to be a hard fought game, but I think Illinois is probably going to pull away at the end. They're just more, proven to me than Duke is. Iowa at Iowa State, good rivalry game here. Iowa State favored by 3.5. I just trust the Iowa State offense more. Obviously, I think that from what we saw defensively in that game with Kansas State, just the way the defense was flying around, the score and the way that kind of played out was just a weird, tough game in Ireland. But the way that they're flying around, I think that I have some trust in them too to obviously keep that Iowa offense at bay, which I think is going to be more of a threat this year than years prior, but still not, still probably one of the worst ones in the sport. So it's a game, it's definitely a game that could go either way, but I favor Iowa State. I do like, I think I do like that number a little bit. I'm not going to bet on it, but yeah, I think that 3.5, I kind of like that number for Iowa State. Baylor at SMU favored by 2.5. So like I said, what is the Baylor defense exactly? Because the way they played in that Auburn game was just kind of inexplicable to me, sitting in too high all day. They weren't even really trying to stop the run, it seemed. So Auburn didn't really throw the ball around at all. I don't know what they're going to do for this SMU game, but I would assume it's going to be different, unless they just know that they have no ability to stop anyone defensively and they just have to cross their fingers and hope that their offense can come out and perform. Unless they are, playing like that, then I would expect to see a different game defensively from Baylor. But otherwise, overall, I think it's kind of a 50-50 game until we know more about both teams. They're just still kind of such a mystery to me. The SMU number, like I said, 2.5. I could go either way. I'm not going to touch this game. So, but I'll just probably take SMU, honestly, just because they're the team that's favored. So, which if that's the case, then Baylor off to an 0-2 start. Not great. You started the season bad last year and won your final 6. So maybe that's what happens again, but not a great start if that's the outcome. Speaking of not a great start, Oklahoma at Oregon. Oregon's a 27.5 point favorite in this game. I knew Oregon would be probably favored bigly over Oklahoma State. I just wasn't expecting that number to be this high. Oklahoma State, I've been kind of a fan of them just from afar. I've never been there, or don't have any association with the program, but just kind of a passive fan from afar. Just pull for him, here and now. But Gundy, I think his tenure is coming probably to an end. His teams, they just seem to be fading. So I think they're probably gonna be looking for a new coach sometime soon, unless they surprise the world and beat Oregon here and show us that that opinion is wrong. But I think Oregon's gonna roll. They just a lot of talent. Obviously, they spend a lot of money on talent. Not a problem in my eyes, and I think they develop it pretty well. So I don't see this being too big of a challenge for Oregon. No offense. Ole Miss, however, they're favored by 8.5 against Kentucky, but I don't know. Kentucky beat you last year. Kentucky always, not always. It's just the last few years they end up winning, 4, 5, 6 games, whatever. But they are just, they're fighters. They can beat you if you don't bring your A game for sure. But they're fighters. So Kentucky, they're not just going to roll over. What is this Lane Kiffin team? What's the kind of culture and identity? Are they going to come into are they a team that's going to come in and beat someone like Kentucky, someone that they're supposed to beat? Because it hasn't always been the case. In fact, it's usually not the case for those Lane Kiffin teams. Unfortunately, as much as I do like Lane Kiffin, his teams sometimes they just come out and they lay an egg. So if that happens here, I'd be interested to see what the narrative becomes around Lane Kiffin if they lay an egg and they drop this game at Kentucky. But it's only week 2. It's not like the circumstance that we had last year. So I expect Ole Miss to win, but hell, you never know. Never know this early in the season. So just comes down to how much fight Kentucky has, honestly. But if Ole Miss rolls, that number 8.5 is too small. If they struggle, then maybe you want to take Kentucky to cover that. So USF at Florida. Florida is a 17.5 point favorite, which kind of, dampens the expectations for how much fight this game is going to have. But, then again, Alabama was a 2-touchdown favorite last week against Florida State, and we saw how that changed. But will Florida prove elite ability? I don't think that they're quite necessarily an elite team. I don't think Florida is going to be consistent enough to be an elite team this year, but do they have an elite ceiling that they can hit whenever they need to? I think that we could see some of that in this game. And if not, then I think, just all the credit to USF means that they have a really good team this year. So finally, we got Arizona State, 6.5-point favorite at Mississippi State. Like I said earlier, how improved is Mississippi State? We're going to find out. Can they give Arizona State a run for their money? Can they win the game? If so, then, they're going to be a team to fight with in the SEC. And Arizona State, on the other hand, can they follow this, that season they had last year up with another good one here? This game is going to be, an indicator of that, how well they play, how prepared, are they. I think that's going to be, a pretty big indicator for Arizona State. And like I've said already, kind of a indicator of strength of conference for the Big 12. So, but I think Arizona State, I'll go ahead and lean with them. Again, similarly, they're not a lot with these two teams that, we can really go too much on yet. I think that Arizona State's probably, they're farther down the line, I think, than the Mississippi State, so I'd expect them to win. But if Mississippi State, depending on how improved they are, that line, I'm not going to touch it. It seems kind of small either way, honestly. I don't see this being too much of a close game. I kind of feel like one team's going to surprise, the other, in a big way offensively. So regardless of who wins, I think it's kind of going to be how it goes. So, but regardless, a bit of a short episode this week. I've had a crazy week. Obviously, this is not a full-time job for me or anything. It's just something I'm trying to get off the ground, and I enjoy doing it. So not as much, depth as I would like to normally get into, but we do have a good week of football coming up. Like I said, not as loaded as we had last week, but I will obviously be watching. We'll be back here next week with reaction to week 2. So until next time, make sure you follow on Twitter at Campus Pigskin. But thank you for listening to this episode of the College Football Podcast.